Welcome to the Fayetteville Public Library, and thank you for joining us in person or those of us joining us online on the live stream. Before you leave today, please be sure to fill out a program evaluation form available at the back of the room or on our website for those watching online. I also want to highlight that we currently have a display of adult nonfiction books on the 4th floor regarding cannabis, so if you need a book to check out before you leave today, check that out. It's the next floor up. Our speaker today is Morgan Ferretti, a fourth-year doctoral candidate in experimental psychology. Morgan will be sharing her studies and insights on how cannabinoids affect the mind and body, comparing how cannabis is portrayed in media versus current scientific research, and exploring misconceptions and tools for critically evaluating claims and sources. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Hi, everyone. Like she just very nicely announced, I'm Morgan. I'm a fourth-year graduate student at the University of Arkansas. I am on my way out this coming May, so I'm approaching graduation with my PhD, which is very exciting. So this is kind of a synthesis of what I've learned in terms of cannabinoid science, kind of where we can go and what the public can gain from understanding science in the media, especially because it often doesn't exactly give us the whole picture. So I want us to be able to provide some education on what claims we should understand and how we should understand them and how to make critical decisions based on that. So that's what my presentation will be on today. So not specifically a topic on cannabis, but kind of some general trends that we see in cannabis media as well as science, and talk about what that looks like from the science perspective as well as the media perspective to give you kind of a more holistic view of what we see happening here right now. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. So first I'll give you a brief kind of explanation of what cannabis is, some general terms that are important to understand the topic, and what we need to know just as a general terminology perspective. I'll give you some information on cannabinoids and their effects, so how they work in the body. I'll give you some brief history on cannabis and as well as what it looks like in modern society today. I'll provide you some explanation on the scientific narrative as well as the media narrative, so what we see in science versus what we see in journalism and in the media pop science kind of area. I'll provide some case examples to make that more concrete. So I'll explain kind of the scientific perspective of a topic as well as the media perspective, where that compares and contrasts. I'll give you a summary of those case examples, what we can take away from those contrasts and key differences. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we can bridge science and understanding so that people can make more informed decisions about when they're using cannabis, how to use, what they should be using or shouldn't be using, and so on. So to start, importantly, what is cannabis? So we've probably heard cannabis before. It's a general term for the cannabis sativa plant. This is the general plant that we get all of these cannabinoids from. So if you were to go to the dispensary, the products that are derived from the cannabis plant are what are sold on those dispensary shelves or by those bud tenders. The cannabis plant contains over 120 cannabinoids, so that's a whole bunch of them. We probably haven't heard about a lot of them, but there are 120 in there. There's also other compounds, so I'll talk a little bit about that, but we're going to focus majorly on cannabinoids today. So basically, the cannabis plant falls into these major cannabinoid categories and minor cannabinoid categories. Major cannabinoid categories are those two that you probably have heard of before: delta-9 THC, which is that high-inducing intoxicating compounds that most people consider cannabis, and then CBD, which is that non-intoxicating compounds that is kind of more often in the media now for things like anxiety reduction, sleep, attention, a whole bunch of outcomes that are of interest to the public for use. There's also a category called minor cannabinoids. This includes some that are not as common, so things like delta-8 THC, delta-10 THC, HHC, CBG, CBN. I could name a whole bunch of acronyms that are probably listed in those 120 cannabinoids, but that would take way too long, and there's a bunch that I still don't know because they haven't been well discovered. And then importantly, there's also some other compounds, so things like terpenes and flavonoids. Those are the things responsible for some of the aromatic that you get from cannabinoids. So limonene, for instance, smells like lemon. Alpha-pinene smells like pines. There's a bunch of them that also exhibit effects and are important in the context of cannabis and how we use it. So I won't be focusing largely on that, but it is important to note that these things are in cannabis products more often than not and are important to consider in this context. I'll note that many cannabinoids are psychoactive. So what psychoactive means is that they impact psychological outcomes. So oftentimes in the media, you'll hear that cannabis is psychoactive, and what they're trying to refer to is actually intoxicating. So the difference here is the intoxicating effects are those high-inducing euphoric effects that we consider when we consider the whole plant cannabis. Psychoactive effects are a little more specific and are related to any psychological outcome. So you could think of something like anxiety or sleep reduction or sleep improvement, but anxiety reduction, mood enhancing effects, those effects that aren't necessarily euphoric but are still impacting your psychological outcomes. That is important to note because the media often uses psychoactive in place of intoxicating, and we really want to make sure that people know the difference, because not all cannabinoids are intoxicating. So there are good uses for some of those that aren't intoxicating. If you, for instance, deal with bad anxiety and you were to go to work, you might not want an intoxicating compound. You might want psychoactive compounds like CBD, where you're not getting those high-inducing effects. Just some key differences there. And then importantly, just for the landscape, it's used for medicinal and or recreational purposes. So many individuals use these for medicinal purposes. Many individuals use these for recreational purposes, or both. Recreationally, as it stands for just a kind of a landscape picture, it's recreationally legal in 24 states, DC, and 3 US territories. It's medicinally legal in 38 states, DC, and 3 US territories. So that kind of gives you the regulatory landscape of what the US looks like right now. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but that's just a general overview. It also is unique. Cannabis is an odd, interesting kind of substance that we have to think of a lot of considerations here. So if you think of alcohol, for instance, we're typically using that in just oral form. You can get it in different kinds of drinks. For instance, wine, liquor, beer, those have different amounts of alcohol, but you're still drinking it. When you talk about cannabis, it's unique because there's a whole bunch of ways to use it. You can smoke it, you can use edibles like gummies, you can vape it, you can use it as a topical, so you can put it on top of your skin, and you can use tincture, so you can take it orally. There's some others that I haven't named, but it's important to note that because all of those different ways actually create different effects. So what we're using and how we're using it can impact how you're feeling when you use cannabis. So that is just a general overview of cannabis and some of the important terminology. I'll now explain cannabinoids and their effects. So we'll go back a second because I kind of missed to explain cannabinoids. So cannabinoids are what is in the product. When you think of a cannabis product, when you're going to the dispensary, the cannabinoids are what you're buying. Cannabis is just what it comes from. So cannabinoids are what makes the products, for instance, delta-9, THC, or CBD. That's what we make product of and is what exerts on the body. So you're fine. Importantly, we'll start with delta-9 THC. That's the most common one, probably what you consider or what you think of when you think of cannabis. It's the primary intoxicating compound. It's likely what you think of when you think of euphoria, altered perception, impaired memory. It also is pretty prolific and robust for treatment in pain, nausea, cancer-related outcomes, and PTSD. These are just to name a few, but it has treatment implications. There's also CBD, which is the primary non-intoxicating compound. This is the one you've probably read in the literature, or not in the literature, but in the media, popping off for different things like reducing anxiety. It's super effective in treating treatment-resistant epilepsy and seizures. Individuals who have had struggles with treatment end up having really good results when they're using CBD to reduce their seizure activity. And then also we see it is pretty robust in pain. So we see that inflammation-based pain is really effective with CBD as well. There's also the minor cannabinoids I mentioned. So these are less studied. There's CBG, CBN, the ones that I said before, THCV, and there's not much that we know about these, although they are pretty heavily pronounced in the media now. They're kind of popping off from all over the place because what's happened is they're accessible all over the country to get for different purposes, and we need science to understand how they're actually working, but we don't really have the science for it. So I'll note that this is super, super low science at this point. We have some preclinical evidence. What that means is we have some animal studies looking at what these cannabinoids do to the body on an animal scale. And then we also have some small-scale human data. So a few studies that might have looked at a couple individuals on what their effects are, or for instance, survey research, what people are already using feel when they use these products. Like I said, these effects are largely unknown. All this is important, and because why are cannabinoids important, and why are they so prolific, and why are we seeing people using them for a whole bunch of reasons, so both psychological outcomes and physiological outcomes. And that's because they exert their effects on the endocannabinoid system, and the endocannabinoid system is actually super unique and important because it regulates a whole ton of systems in your body. So we typically think of a system for maybe a couple roles, for instance, like memory or whatever it might be, anxiety, kind of different topics that you consider when you think of a system, but the endocannabinoid system actually impacts a whole bunch of outcomes. So that's why we're seeing cannabis be used for all these topics. So things like mood, pain, sleep, anxiety, appetite, it impacts all of these outcomes because the system it's working on impacts all of these outcomes. So it's not just one kind of specific outcome that we're interested in here. That being said, there is a huge knowledge gap with this topic. There is very little known. As someone who's been doing cannabinoid science for 6 years now and trying to learn as much as I can throughout my career, academic career so far, there's very little that we know. And speaking as someone I would consider an expert, I don't know a whole ton on this topic because there's not much to know so far. And I'll kind of dive into that because it's hard to study what we're studying. Cannabis is really hard to study because of regulatory problems, funding problems, which I'll talk about, but we don't know a whole bunch, and that is a problem considering there is so much access to it, and the access is only getting bigger and unregulated, so it's important that we make these conclusions based on science. So, like I said, there's 120 cannabinoids. Less than 10% have been studied rigorously, and that is probably more like 5% if we really think about how they've been studied, because even the ones that have been studied rigorously are still not that well studied. So it's important to consider how much we don't know in this space. So based on a little bit about cannabis and cannabinoids, I explained what they are, what we're interested in about them, what they do, but I kind of want to give you a brief history of cannabis because it'll provide context for why science looks different than media right now, and then why we still have struggles trying to study this. So we can start all the way back in ancient use, so 2700 BC. We see that China, India, and Egypt were using it for medicinal purposes, ritual purposes, and for industrial purposes, so making things like cloth or rope, which is interesting, but also we saw those medicinal purposes from the beginning for why we were using cannabis. That's where it started. If we go up to the 1800s, this is where we see that transition strongly into medicinal reasons. So we see cannabis tinctures, that oral form of cannabis is being used for reasons that are being prescribed. So from a pharmacy, cannabis is being prescribed in the 1800s for things like pain, nausea, seizures, different topics that we're talking about here, but without much research on it. So it was prescribed, but there wasn't much to know about it. So it's a kind of interesting phenomenon that it was being prescribed by pharmacies. We'll zoom up to the 1930s. So up until that point, up until the 1930s, it was gaining traction for medicinal purposes. And then in the 1930s, that created a halt, and that was the reefer madness era. So this is what led to the criminalization and the negative stigma behind cannabis use. And to provide some context for this, there was large propaganda in the 1930s that cannabis use was leading to violence. Individuals that were using it were the ones that were problematic. They were the ones that were having sexual violence or domestic violence. They were kind of the satanic people, is what the government, as well as movies, as well as the media, were portraying these cannabis users to be, even though there was completely valid reasons and the science didn't actually back that up. So there was kind of a bunch of reasons, racially charged reasons, for people to make these negative connotations behind cannabis, which led to this criminalization of it, which halted all medicinal purposes, essentially. So people stopped using it for those real valid reasons that it was being used for, and it really halted research at the time and halted any reason to give it a good look in terms of why we should use it medicinally. Then that continued throughout the 1900s, and we see in 1970 it actually got scheduled as a Schedule I substance. And what a Schedule I substance means is that it has no medicinal benefits at all. Another one that's in Schedule I is heroin, for instance. So if you consider heroin and cannabis in the same place, that's super interesting, because we know heroin does not have any medicinal benefits. We know cannabis does have medicinal benefits. However, because of, like I mentioned, this reefer madness era, it was criminalized, and there was reason to say, oh, it shouldn't work, or no, it shouldn't work, because people were putting that into the world. So they scheduled it, and this essentially halted everything. There couldn't be research on it, people couldn't use it. It stopped us from making any progress in terms of science and understanding both safety and negative effects-wise, because I do want to paint a holistic picture. I don't want to just think of the positive things, but also the negative things. There's people that shouldn't be using it, or there's contexts where it shouldn't be used, but there's also many contexts where it should be used, and it's important to consider both. And this Schedule I classification diminished the ability to do so. So we see that through the 1970s, 1980s, 90s. And then in 1996, California actually made a proposition to that and then legalized medical cannabis. They started doing their own research on why cannabis should be used for medicinal purposes, and that created one change in the laws, which allowed for medicinal cannabis, and kind of where was that policy shift started. So now we're in this place where there's a negative stigma and a positive stigma, and they're pulling against each other in a way that is hard to reconcile for both sides. And what that led to is more research, still not much, because we're still Schedule I, so it's still federally illegal. There's still not much access to it, but at least we're making progress in terms of being able to do the research. Fast forward a little bit, Colorado and Washington legalized it in 2012 for recreational use. So not only was the medicinal use being transformed, also recreational use was being transformed. So this is where we see the policy shifts even more. We see now, like I said, 24 states that are recreational and 38 states that are medicinal, all because of these couple states that made transitions into looking at it from a medicinal and a recreational perspective, not a Schedule I substance. And today, that global landscape continues to shift. It's now over $100 billion industry. It is ongoing in terms of research. We're trying every day to make it more accessible in terms of research, so then we have better regulatory considerations when we're making decisions on cannabis and how it should be regulated, how it should be legalized, and so on. And it is important to consider all of these past history points, because it has led to what is kind of this clash of sides between if cannabis should be legalized or if cannabis should not be legalized. And they kind of are polar opposites, and people want us to be on polar opposites, but really we live somewhere in the gray in this context. There's not necessarily a spot that we can say, yes, we should use it for all of these purposes, and there's not a spot where we should say, no, we have no use for this. It's more in the middle, and we need to consider all of these things as to why we got here. So that's just a brief history, but now I'll focus more on cannabis in modern society. So where we are now, what the science looks like, and where we need to go to get us to a place where the media, the science, and consumers all have a general understanding of what's happening. So importantly, mainstream normalization, so legal access across the world has gone up. So we see it's expanding in North America, but also in Europe, Latin America, Canada, Australia. All these places are doing the research and are giving more access to their populations to use cannabis, yet we still don't know that much about it. So although it's normal, it's this kind of conundrum where we don't really know what we're using. We don't know how to regulate it. We don't know what to put in it. We don't know where the stop and where the start limit is. So it's important to think about that in the context of little research we have. Widespread use, so it's now increased to over 220 million users. So why is this important? Because it's one of the most actively used drugs in the world, so we need to have a whole bunch of more information on it. Probably a bunch of people within your community, at least one of them or a couple of them are using cannabis, and that's an important consideration if you really think about it, for safety reasons as well as medicinal reasons. Medically, it is also medically legit. So like I said, there's those spectrums where we have individuals that say, no, we definitely shouldn't use it. And then we have these individuals that say, yes, we definitely should use it. The side that says, yes, we definitely should use it does have some medical legitimacy. So for instance, it is approved for epilepsy by the FDA. It's approved for chronic pain by the FDA, chemotherapy-related nausea. It really works for these things. However, we need to consider the context. So when you hear it works for these things, that doesn't mean it's going to work in a situation similar just because you're having pain. We need to understand the context under which it's working for pain, or if it's working for nausea, why, what mechanisms is it working under, and to do so, we need to do more research. There's also ongoing trials for anxiety, PTSD, sleep, ADHD, a whole bunch of topics that you've probably heard in the media that people are using these products for and that we need to study cannabis for. Importantly, the economic transformation. So not only do we have stakeholders in the medical community, in the cannabis industry, also there's an economic transformation. So there are a whole bunch of stakeholders in here. Like I said, it's over $100 billion industry. By 2030, it's supposed to be over $400 billion. That's probably one of the larger industries that you've heard of, and it is important that we put resources behind this industry to back the science as well as the media, because the bigger it gets, the more the media is going to take off, and the more we need to be able to back those claims, or at least not back those claims, make some good judgment calls on this. It's also led to a surge in jobs, taxation, and research and development investment. So yes, there's improvements, but we still got a whole long way to go. And importantly is that media polarization. So it's interesting because like there is this push and pull with the yes, we should use it and no, we shouldn't use it. It's similar in the media. So there's the people in the media that say it's a wellness revolution, alternative medicine, natural medicine. There's also people in the media that are saying it's a public health crisis. Adolescents shouldn't be using this and they have access to it. There's individuals that are getting cannabis use disorder. There are definitely indications where it should not be used, and it's often polarized in the media to be one or the other when it's really not one or the other, it's both. So we need to consider that in all contexts. So now that I've provided some context for cannabis, what it looks like, where we are in terms of kind of what the trends look like economically, medicinally, regulatory, I want to provide the scientific narrative and the media narrative so we can get a better understanding for what we're reading in cannabis science and then what we should actually take home from the work that we're reading, whether it's media or on the news or whatever it might be. So the scientific narrative to start, where I am deeply rooted but also derive a lot of my science from what the media says. So I will take a media claim, for instance, we're going to talk about it, and I'll make a research question or I'll try and study that because that's the work that needs to be done. If it's already out there in the media, let's provide some science behind it. Let's actually see if it works. And that's where I make a lot of my research questions from. So I have this scientific narrative, but I usually consider the media narrative as well in these contexts. So the scientific evidence remains limited because, like I said, it is still a Schedule I substance. So although it is medically legit and the FDA even has approved indications for it, it is still Schedule I, even though there are shifts to Schedule III. It hasn't happened yet. There's still problems in terms of regulatory situations happening, and they haven't made that shift 100% yet. So we are still in Schedule I status, which means there's no medicinal benefits for using cannabis. That continues to create barriers for funding from the government and from general funding sources that individuals do research from. And then there's a lack of product standardization. So because of how this cannabis world has played out, we see that there's not much standardization here. We don't know if we should be standardizing it in a certain way, because the research hasn't been able to show us that. And we need a whole bunch of more research to get to these points. The strongest clinical support, so what we do know something about, is chronic pain, nausea, vomiting, and certain forms of epilepsy, like I mentioned. Those are the ones that we see are robust and we know are most likely definitely effective for these situations. There's some moderate or mixed evidence for psychological related outcomes. So those are the ones that we see more in the media right now. Anxiety, PTSD actually has some good evidence behind it. Sleep has some good evidence, but then ADHD is kind of up in the air. Anxiety is up in the air. There's a whole bunch of self-report, for instance, consumers that are telling us it works for those purposes, that give us some evidence, but when we pull from controlled studies in the lab, it's not as effective as we would expect it to be. So it's pretty mixed in terms of what we know for what works from cannabis. The long-term risks and benefits remain uncertain. So importantly, we don't know much about it for how it impacts our bodies in the long term, for many reasons. One, it's been hard to study for long term because of all these regulatory changes. So for example, people that were using in the 90s didn't have access to it from a regulatory standpoint from the early 90s compared to now where they do. So that creates a problem in terms of studying it for long-term points, as well as it is just hard to study people across the lifespan. So individuals that might be using early on in their life, it's hard to get in contact with them later on in their life. So we don't have much evidence in terms of how it impacts us long-term, risk and benefits-wise. It's also super context dependent. So this is super confusing often for us in the literature. There are a whole bunch of considerations when you think of cannabis. Like I mentioned, you can use it a whole bunch of different ways, edibles, you can smoke it, you can use it as a topical, and all of those create different impacts, as well as how much they're using. So if these are daily users, that impacts how much they feel. If these are monthly users or less, they might have different impacts. Cannabinoid ratio, so a lot of these products don't just contain one cannabinoid, so THC for instance. It usually also contains some CBD, terpenes, flavonoids, it's a whole bunch of things put into one product, and we don't know how those combinations necessarily work to make their effects on the body, and if we take one out, what does it do? If we add another one in, what does it do? We don't know those things, and it's important to consider those things as we use. And then importantly, prior exposure. So how much have they used in the past? Have they stopped using and now they're using again? What are those contexts that really make differences in how we feel the drug that we're putting into our body? Lastly, like I said, there's a cannabinoid ratio point, so what is in the product? So delta-9 THC is often what you are going to the store to buy for those high-inducing properties. In a regular flower, it's really around 25 to 30% of that product is delta-9 THC. So what else is in that product? CBD, terpenes, all these other things that are actually exerting effects that we don't know about. And it's important to consider all of them in the context of use, not just this one specific cannabinoid that we're using or that we're trying to buy, because in reality, those aren't the products that are being sold. So that's the scientific narrative. All to say, we don't know that much, even though it is all over the place and is extremely accessible. There's very little that we can really make conclusive claims on. That emphasizes the need for rigor and widespread research, so we need a whole ton more of this across states, across the country. We need to be able to do this research, and often we're not able to do this research because of regulatory considerations, but we need to make those small steps to continue to understand what's happening here. Now I'll switch to the media narrative. So the media narrative is a little different. It provides an easier way for us to digest science, but it provides also some misinformation that I want to consider in the context of this really confusing topic. So media outlets often highlight the positive or the sensational claims. They're the ones that are making you say, go use it for ADHD, go use it for anxiety. This helped my sleep. I sleep the best I have slept in years because of cannabis. They make those sensational claims that people are reading and seeing and being like, oh, I should try this for myself often, when necessarily the work that they're citing is small effect sizes. So what that means is it's not really doing that much in science, but it is showing a difference, for instance. But we don't know how big that difference is, and the claims make it look like that difference might be bigger than it is. It also provides this framing of a natural cure or alternative medicine. And although it is a plant-based medicine, it's important to consider where you're getting the product from. So for instance, a lot of these products have been sold on gas station stores, and those products might have things including heavy metals or different situations where they're not as clean as they should be. So although they're providing this framework that this is a natural alternative and you should be able to go get it wherever you want to get it from, it isn't necessarily the safest, dependent on where you're getting it from. So it is important to consider that as well, although the framing looks nice for that natural cure. Social media also amplifies anecdotal claims. So what that means is they're not backed by science often. Sometimes you'll hear a couple people say it, or you'll hear some opinions on how it's used. And although that is completely valid, how people feel and how people perceive the drug is super important, it's important to consider what might be impacting that. So what else are they using? What did they expect to feel when they used it? Because expectancies might drive those effects. So it's important to consider what they're saying and where they're getting their information from. So they rely on things that are anecdotal and not necessarily backed by science, rather than those peer-reviewed articles that take years to get out there. And that is why this is happening, because science moves slow and media moves fast. So there's this contrast here that we have to really try and figure out how to bridge that gap. And that's why I'm explaining these differences right now. Industry PR, so the cannabinoid industry will often try to hype these claims as much as possible, because at the end of the day, they want to make money too. And then influencers also want to make money, and they will endorse things based on that. So there's claims that are being backed not necessarily by science, but driven by money or driven by what you already think about the product, and it's important to consider the whole picture. And then importantly, like I said, cannabis is super context dependent, how you use, where you use, what you're using. And the headlines often omit this information. So they might tell you to go use CBD for anxiety. How much should I use? I don't know. How much, or what kind should I use? Should I smoke it? Should I take edibles? Should I vape it? Should I put it on my body? I don't know. Most of these things aren't in there, and I have to figure out how to understand those contexts of what to use and when to use it. Lastly, they often get less visibility on negative outcomes unless you're a doom scroller, which I am also a doom scroller. So I don't want to say that there are no media outlets that provide the negative outcomes, but oftentimes people like to avoid the negative outcomes because it's not a great thing to hear about. But it is important to note that there are negative outcomes that are often being overlooked based on the framework in media. So let's just talk about the key differences and contrasts here, and then I'm going to provide some context here. So I'm going to give some examples of what the science looks like for a topic, and then what the media looks like to kind of make it a little more concrete. So science is cautious, data-driven, and nuanced. So it moves slowly. We make small changes to studies to try and understand what's happening in the work. So for instance, CBD and anxiety, which I'll use as an example later, we make small changes. So we'll up the dose for the next study to see if a stronger dose might be effective, or we'll change the sample. So we'll look at healthy individuals versus individuals that are dealing with anxiety disorders. How do those change it? Small changes to help us understand the whole picture, and that takes years to do one of those studies. Takes another couple years to do a second one, and so on. So we can't move very fast here. It also aims to inform and refine our understanding. The goal is to get a better picture and really understand what's happening here, and less so to create a public conception of what we should be using. Media is often simplified, emotional, and attention-grabbing. The responsibility of the media is just that. That's their goal, is to create something that's attention-grabbing and simplified. That's important. It's super important to make science more simple for their readers. The public needs to be able to understand it, and sometimes science can be dense and super hard to read. Even for me, who's been reading it for years, I still have to read some of these articles time and time again and still don't fully understand them sometimes. So media does a good job of simplifying that, but it also creates kind of this misinformation expectancy where we don't know as much as we need to. It prioritizes novelty, speed, and engagement. So in any media company, they're trying to get articles out very quickly. They need to as part of their role, but that doesn't necessarily line up with how the science is working. They can't wait a couple years to make an article when we have to wait a couple years to make an article. So their claims are changing. The claims are changing too fast for what we actually know. And then they communicate through those headlines and visuals. So often people will read just the headline and make a decision based on that headline rather than actually seeing what the article says. And some articles and some media outlets do a great job of explaining what the scientific article says. They provide primary sources, they provide you links to the actual science, but in a lot of times, many individuals aren't reading that. They're seeing the Instagram post and looking at what that picture says and then going and making a decision without actually reading what the article says. And in all, they're aimed to attract audiences and to sustain interest. So their overarching goal is a little bit different than the science goal. So based on those key contrasts, I'm going to explain some topics within the cannabis world that are kind of interesting and unique to how we talk about them. I'm going to start with one called sativa versus indica, because this is actually a super interesting one. Cannabis is, like I mentioned in the beginning, is the cannabis sativa plant. So what that means is it's a botanical classification, so it's just a label for the plant. Sativa and indica, though, is kind of what you consider as these two different areas of cannabis. We have indica, which is the relaxing one, and sativa, which is the uplifting one. We see that those are botanical classifications is where those came from. So there was actually two different plants happening here. There was the sativa plant and the indica plant. We've learned through the years that these plants have been crossbred many, many times to create a situation where there's actually not really a difference between these two sativa plants and the indica plant, and it's actually, we label everything under the cannabis sativa plant now. If you go to the dispensary, all of those products are coming from the sativa plant, and there's no consistent chemical differences between sativa and indica, although we see on the market and through media that there's these really hard claims as to what these two different things do. In reality, those don't align with what the products are saying they are. So for example, those energizing versus sedating effects, they don't align with what the cannabinoid and terpene profiles are showing. There's not differences between those two. So why are we saying that there are? Kind of situation is what's going on there. What is the purpose? And if we think about it in context of the media portrayal, it really is a marketing frame. So indica or sativa, uplifting, creative, daytime use. Indica, relaxing, sleepy, nighttime use. So you can expect that when you're told that this product's gonna work for a daytime purpose, you might really experience those effects just because you're expecting to feel those things. Although what's actually creating those effects is likely what's in the product. So those cannabinoids, like I said, delta-9 THC, if there's more CBD or less CBD, if there's specific terpenes, so like I mentioned, there's a specific terpene called limonene. If there's more of limonene, that actually might be what's having those reducing or relaxing effects, not just it being a sativa strain versus an indica strain, because even if you go to another state, those sativa and indica strains actually crossbreed a bunch of times. So you really want to consider what's in the product and not just what is being told to you based on sativa and indica. Although the website's packaging and dispensaries still reinforce this split, and I actually think there are some benefits to using these terms in the context of putting products like cannabinoid dominant products that are relaxing into a sativa category, although we need to explain that better. So it's not the sativa plant versus the indica plant. It's the cannabinoids in each of those products that we need to consider. So I think it's important to create a distinguishment where people can go into the dispensary and say, I want something that's relaxing, I want something that helps me sleep, and you can say, oh, this is a sativa-like product or an indica-like product, but it's not actually a different plant, and it's important that they understand that so they can make more informed decisions on what kind of products are working for them. And then social media influencers are also using this topic, so it's really hard to stray away from this. So I think there's a place where we can find some happy medium to use these topics without creating misinformation that we're using different things in these contexts when we're not using different things. So key takeaway, sativa and indica have a little scientific meaning today. The effects are actually varied by cannabinoid terpene profile, not the strain label. So individuals are making these products based on the cannabinoid terpene profile and putting them into these categories and marketing them that way. But you should also look into what these cannabinoid profiles are. What are the profiles that work for me best? Not just indica versus sativa. That's one example. Now we'll talk a little bit about CBD and anxiety. So this is a big one. This is kind of where we saw a boom in terms of the cannabis science world becoming in the media world. So what we see with CBD, the non-intoxicating cannabinoid I mentioned, is that acute oral doses may reduce experimentally induced anxiety. So what that means is when you bring people into the lab, you get them anxious and you give them CBD, it might help reduce their anxiety from where you got them to be anxious, although studies are very mixed in these findings. And it's important to note in these studies, it's super dose dependent, like I mentioned, how much you're using. It's super context specific, so where they are and what is around them. And then it's often not replicated. So although we find it in one study, we aren't finding it in other studies, and it's created this conundrum. Does CBD really work for anxiety? How much do we know? Who should use it? And the evidence quality has now become pretty moderate and mixed, and there's some major gaps. So we don't really know if it works for CBD or for anxiety, although the media really says it does. So for example, headlines like "Leave Anxiety Behind," things you need to know about CBD as a treatment for anxiety. That's just one of them, but there are a whole bunch of articles out there that say CBD is great for anxiety, and it is important to consider that the science has moved a little bit since then, but we don't usually consider those changes. So it's not working in healthy individuals, for instance. It might work in individuals that have anxiety problems, but not for those healthy individuals, for example. It's also focusing largely on what people are saying about what they're using, which is, like I said, valid, and it's important to get those personal testimonials, but they're likely being driven by what people are telling them to use and how they're using. And it also provides that natural wellness framing, which is part of the wellness revolution that's being portrayed by cannabis media. It often omits the important information like dosage. It doesn't necessarily control for placebo. So we found a lot of times individuals reduce their anxiety even when they're giving a placebo soft gel. So even when they're given just a little bit of fat or like fat oil, it is reducing their anxiety, and the CBD is not doing much more above what the placebo soft gel does. And then importantly, we don't know much in terms of who it's working for. So sample size limitations, we haven't looked at that many groups of people. Is it super beneficial in people with anxiety? Is it super beneficial in people with comorbid anxiety and depression? Is it only context specific to when they have social anxiety, for instance, before you're giving a talk or before you're going into a social setting? Or is it more generalized to people that have anxiety across the board? We don't know that much information yet to make those claims, yet the media wants to make those claims. Importantly, the media coverage can oversimplify these results. So a lot of the media is based on a couple early findings that were pretty robust, showing that CBD is great for anxiety. It ran with those, but now we've caught up a little bit, and the work is showing that it might not be as effective as we want it to be. So it is modest, situational, and very understudied, and oftentimes we can't paint that whole picture within a sentence or a picture that we want to paint that. So that's just another example. One more example is THC and cognition. This one's kind of interesting because it provides context for both positive and negative impacts in the media. So science shows that acute THC impairs attention, so that high-inducing cannabinoid, it impairs attention, working memory, and psychomotor performance. So it has negative impacts on cognitive performance, for instance. And then we see that chronic heavy use, often before age 18, has persistent cognitive deficits, as well as increased psychosis risk in the individuals that are already vulnerable for psychosis. And then it also shows that there is partial or full recovery after abstinence, although many individuals think that if you use in your lifetime, you're going to have those deficits for life, although the science doesn't necessarily show that. What the media shows here is things now, which is interesting, headlines such as cannabis and creativity, how marijuana can boost your imagination. So there's this contrast of there is impairment for THC, but now individuals are using it for things like creativity, to do art, to actually focus more. So ADHD is a big one. There is this positive framing behind it without the considerations for these long-term effects that I mentioned. So things like persistent cognitive deficits. So short-term, it might make you feel more creative, but then what's it doing long-term? Is your creativity going to be stifled in a couple months because you've been using regularly? Or is it going to continue to stay in that creative mindset because of what you're expecting to feel? And then also, there's again limited discussion on dose, frequency, and those trade-offs that I just mentioned. The key takeaway being that media tends to romanticize THC's effects on creativity while not considering those cognitive deficits. So like I said, the media often there's less visibility on those negative outcomes while there's more visibility on those positive outcomes. For instance, using it for things like creativity. One more example is the CBG and ADHD example. So scientific findings right now, CBG is a super unknown cannabinoid. We just started studying it in humans within the past couple years. We do know it's safe, but we really don't know how it works. And all we know mostly is from minimal preclinical evidence and then some self-report studies saying individuals are using it for things like ADHD. So we know that it impacts certain systems that work on the body that are similar to ADHD medications. So that gives us a framework for why it might work. We don't actually have any evidence that it does work. So these claims of improved focus or calmness aren't actually validated in the lab. I'm doing a study right now at the U of A to hopefully create some evidence behind this, but there is no work out there that has said CBG is effective for ADHD. However, if you look at the media, how CBG has been a game changer for my ADHD. That is one of the biggest topics that I've seen, and even that the cannabis industry is talking about, is CBG is the answer for ADHD. It works on the same mechanisms, and it's gonna work for your ADHD. But in reality, we have no idea if that's the case. It might actually be doing the opposite, and we have no idea because the work isn't out there to say it. And these products are being marketed as a natural Adderall, that kind of natural wellness framework, to use for ADHD. However, we don't have the research to say we should be using it. So importantly, this is a perfect example of how the science is lagging behind cannabinoid consumerism. So we see people are saying to use it, but we don't actually have anything to back it up. And this is a great example of why we see science cannot work as fast as the media can. I've been running this study for 2 years now. And the media has been out there saying this for about 2 years now, and we still don't have the claims. So we can't make that claim until we have some research behind it. Let's synthesize what I just explained in these case examples. So importantly, media outpaces science. So let's consider that when we read our media outlets. The effects are more modest and conditional than portrayed. So it's not going to work for everyone. It's not going to work in all contexts. And we need to make sure that the public understands that, as well as the scientists understand that. We need to make real evidence-based claims in these topics or in these headlines that we're making. It works for these people, for example. It works in these contexts, not just the general frameworks that we're seeing. Marketing categories do not equal scientific categories, so what is being marketed doesn't necessarily match on to the science. And then evidence gaps drive public misperception. So this is important because when we don't have the knowledge, we try and fill in those gaps. Whether we know it or not, we try to make conclusions based on work that we don't have, and that continues to drive these kind of public misperceptions that we're seeing. And it's important to consider these in the context of what we're reading. So why does this gap exist? Federal restrictions, Schedule 1 status, and the lack of funding slow scientific progress. That's where we need to make efforts to change. We can't do much until we're rescheduled here because there are a lot of restrictions. To be able to study Delta-9 THC, you need a Schedule 1 license. That takes a whole bunch of extra licensure to be able to study that. And oftentimes you can't do it in states where it's illegal anyways. Journalistic simplification is needed for public readability. So again, it is super important for us to simplify the science and make it readable, but we also need to make sure those claims are not being simplified too much where we're taking out the important messages here. And then commercial marketing pressures drive how we behave. So if you're hearing that you should use it for this purpose, it's going to drive you to use it, and then you're going to think it's working for those reasons, even though we don't actually know if it's working for those reasons or if it's yourself telling yourself that it's going to work. It's kind of like an expectancy effect, a placebo effect, if you've ever heard. People use them all the time. People with sleep problems, for example, will get a sugar pill and it'll make them feel like they're sleeping better, even though they are just getting sugar. So there isn't actually any mechanism happen other than your brain telling you it should be working. And then they often drive the regulatory decisions. So the reason it's still illegal or the reason it's becoming legal is often by these media decisions that are being made rather than what the science says. And then lastly, that historical stigma I mentioned and misinformation persists. So a lot of individuals don't know where this history comes from and why we have this push and pull between if we should use it and if we shouldn't use it. And it creates this gap, and we need to bridge this gap, essentially, is where we need to go from here so that the public understands it better, science understands it better, and the media can understand it better. So what can we do? Scientists can communicate findings clearly and accessibly so they can make it more readable for individuals to make those claims or understand those claims that are being made. Journalists should reference primary sources and report limitations or context-relevant information, so they shouldn't bring it down to a sentence or two when we really do need a paragraph or a couple paragraphs to understand what's going on. The public, my goal is for them to evaluate claims critically and seek the evidence-based information, so not just believe what you see. That's super important. I tend to believe what I see a lot of the time. I am just as much at fault as that, and it's important to really understand what you're reading, ask questions about what you're reading, kind of make judgment calls on your own based on what the science says, not just what the media says. And then importantly, collaborative outreach. None of this can happen without the other part. So scientists, journalists, and the public need to work together to create a better understanding of what cannabis is and how it works and how it should be used. Lastly, some conclusions I'll like to mention is that cannabis is complex. It's neither a miracle or a menace. We don't really have a good explanation of whether it should be used in all contexts or in no context. It falls in the middle, like I said, and it's important to consider both sides rather than just one. And like I mentioned, science evolves slowly, media moves fast, so as much as we want to make those claims as fast as we can, that's not the reality of science, and it's important that we portray that to individuals as well as the different stakeholders. So we need the media to make decisions based on what scientists are saying, and scientists as well from the media, as well as regulatory populations should be looking at all of these things combined. And then there needs to be some critical thinking in how we interpret these cannabis claims. So what we're actually reading, how do we make conclusions based on that? We need to allow individuals to know how to make those conclusions, and part of that is education and allowing individuals to really make those claims and critical thinking decisions for themselves. And then understanding both science and the media helps build informed perspectives. So like I said, it's not an either-or situation, it's a both. So we need to work together to create a better informed system where we can understand cannabis from a user perspective, a media perspective, and a scientific perspective. And that's it. Thank you. And if you have any questions, go for it.
You mentioned that contemporary headlines are evolving faster than the science throughout the presentation, it sounded like there's quite, in what scientists would believe, a negative outlook on cannabis, and that we need to try to fill the evidence gap as a solution to maybe a problem, I believe, that we have. Do you believe that the media headline should be straightforward, that there is a negative outlook, or do you believe that the media headline is more complicated than that?
A few responses to a couple things that you said. So I think I'll start with your first question, which is what kind of media are you talking about? I think it is across the board. So people on social media, for instance, there's individuals that are endorsing products just because they are getting endorsement and they're told to, positively endorse it. But then there's things like Forbes, just general news places that are making these claims. They do a pretty good job of making sure that what they're saying is in line with what the science says. They usually give you the article that they're making claims from. Forbes is a good one. They try to do their best, but at the end of the day, it does oversimplify it. I think they translate it in a way where it's digestible and it's also not too overwhelming, which is important. But it provides kind of this area where they're making a conclusion when there actually isn't a conclusion. So I think what you're getting at is we're trying to make statements that are true and that can't be necessarily changed. And in this context, there are no true statements at this point. We don't know if it's working effectively for these purposes. So I think the headlines are trying to be very discreet when it's not as discreet as we want it to be. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be attention grabbing and they're supposed to be discreet, but I think there should be some context, like it's not as clear of a picture, and that could be a subheading or whatever it might be, or in these, I think they need to provide a little bit more information in terms of when it's working and how it's working, and then give all the information within the article or provide context to how to get to the article. I just think we need more evidence we need more clear expectations of what the article is going to tell you rather than just making one concrete claim. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay, perfect. Go for it.
great talk, Morgan. Really
Thanks.
informative. I'm curious, is there any work that's being done in terms of the genetic profiles of the endocannabinoid system, like kind of getting at the personalized medicine push that, maybe someday we'll do that, but are there any things that have been done in that realm?
Not too much, honestly. Like I said, we're barely there. We're barely at the point where we understand cannabinoids themselves. So I think that is where we need to get to, essentially, is what you're saying, individualized based medicine. So knowing what you need in a product. Is it high THC? Is it high CBD? And those genetic profiles that you're talking about and how they work. But there's very little work on that specifically because it is so independent. And we are at the point where we still just need large-scale studies, and we're not at the point where we can make it super individualized yet, although that's what we want to get to because that's how consumers are going to be using it, I think, but little to none done that way, and I think that's where we need to get to. Yes?
Hi, I noticed that you listed where some of your resources were. So I don't know if you have any firsthand interviews with people or that we have a historical influencer who's been here for decades in Fayetteville and prominent for years and years on the square gathering signatures. He gathered the most signatures of anyone to get it on the ballot in the
Yeah.
state. Okay, so you have interviewed him?
I haven't interviewed him, but I know what you're talking about
I
because,
think after 4 years pursuing the master's, you might have interviewed him because he is significant.
yeah, I mean, it's hard to get. I have been doing it from a general industry perspective, so I've been working across the country with individuals that are in the industry getting these products. I am just now getting into the Fayetteville kind of area of what they're using. I have been trying to get my dissertation up for 3 years now, just from regulatory purposes, so it's been hard for me to go out into the community as much as I would want to and talk to these individuals that are trying to get onto the ballot. I agree that that is super important and that we need to do that. I just haven't had the access to do it yet.
Because, I mean, for example, he could be a first-hand interview, or he testifies that he recovered from colon cancer
Yeah.
because of the use. And he knows many others who can give same testimony.
100%. And I want to hear all those testimonies. I think they're super important. And I, from this standpoint, don't want to stand up here and tell people to use, but I also don't want to tell them not to use. I mostly want to allow people to make those decisions for themselves. So I think all of those claims are super valid, and I am more than willing to go out and hear more about those. I just haven't gotten to that point yet where I've had enough time to really go into the world when I'm running people in the lab kind of doing those sessions. I am kind of trying to create the work to allow people to really have evidence behind the claims they're making, you know what I mean? So oftentimes people will diminish those claims because it's just anecdotal, but I really want to provide the evidence for people to go and be like, okay, it worked for me, but it's also working for a bunch of other people.
In that case, it wouldn't be anecdotal anymore.
It wouldn't be anecdotal, but we don't have that yet, and that's kind of what I'm trying to bridge a gap and do the controlled studies. Yeah, 100%. That's what I'm trying to get to.
In addition, for some reason, the same person seems to believe that he has evidence that marijuana was used in the Old Testament as the anointing oil.
Yeah.
So interesting.
100%. I mean, it's vast. There's just a lot. There's a lot to know at the end of the day. Like I said, there's 120 cannabinoids, and I've been studying ones that haven't been well studied, and aren't really used for that many purposes, but have some claims against them. So I am trying to kind of be an expert on the topics that I have been researching and then expanding from there, just because there is so much to know. I think it's hard to do it all at once, and it's going to take me a long time to get to the point where I can say all of these things with great confidence. Go for it.
Morgan, great talk. You mentioned this a minute ago, and I think part of this is we could hope that media outlets will curtail some of their, kind of gimmicky headlines. But we know that that's probably not going to happen very quickly. So for those of us who are a little less knowledgeable about cannabis, when we see a headline like that, what could be kind of a go-to for us to kind of check and kind of make our own decisions, not just ones that are portrayed just by the media?
For sure. I think importantly is when you read something in the media to do your own research. So not just rely on that one claim that's being made, but see if there's other stuff out there that kind of testifies to what they're saying. So like she mentioned, personal testimonials are super important. Are there blogs, are there websites that are talking more about this? Just don't rely on one claim, rather than try and build a picture for yourself, and also consider yourself in context. So you read this claim about CBD and anxiety, for example. Who is it working for in this article that they're talking about, and then making a more informed decision about that. So I would consider if there's any local, for instance, populations that you can gain access to, or just online. I am not saying to not use the media. I'm mostly saying just to make sure you're really reading into it and not just going based on what the one sentence that you're reading in a headline says. I think it's important to read the media, and I think it's important to understand what they're saying and where they're getting their sources from, but just use it as kind of a starting point rather than the end point. Use it to research your own online, or look into books. Like they said, they have a nonfiction cannabis book section here. Kind of just do your own research as much as you can to get a better understanding. I know that's hard and it's ambiguous, and we often want things to be simplified, but this is a complex topic. And often we don't know that much about it, so it's important to consider how we can use it and where we can get more information from.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This might not be your field of study,
Mhm.
but I just noticed that it's a Schedule I, which means there's no medicinal uses, but apparently it's FDA approved for epilepsy, which seems like a direct contradiction in the government. Is this just like a bureaucratic phenomenon, or is there some rationalization for why that still exists?
Both, I would say. It's not as much, like you said, my field of study. I'm trying to get more understanding of the regulatory considerations. A lot of it is a bureaucratic phenomenon, so there are individuals that are still pushing for it to not be used at all in the context of it, but we know that it really works for these conditions, treatment-resistant Epidiolex, for instance, that's CBD, is approved by the FDA for treatment-resistant epilepsy, and it is crazy effective. Essentially, individuals that have no other option will use that after years and years of trying, and it works phenomenally for them and essentially reduces their seizures to close to none in some cases. But there's still the individuals that are stuck on that negative stigma that we've seen from years and years of history of being told that it should be criminalized and that people are using it for the wrong reasons and it's leading to bad outcomes. So I think it's both. It is a direct contradiction, and I think it's because it's complex. So oftentimes cannabis is what's framed under Schedule 1, but it's the cannabinoids that we're using. So for instance, those specific cannabinoids are being curtailed into that cannabis context, even though they're not all the same. So there needs to be a better understanding from the public and from regulatory considerations to make changes. And there's not enough science to do that is kind of where we're at. It's kind of a conundrum where they don't know how to make the decisions because we don't have enough research. Exactly. So it's like a negative cycle that we have going. And it just happened again with the government shutdown bill. They put a provision in for the hemp bill, which allowed hemp products to be accessible across the country. They put a provision in where it essentially is going to wipe those out, although we don't need them to be wiped out because oftentimes they're really effective for treatment, but they're trying to wipe it out for those non-regulated Delta-8 products, for instance, that you're buying on the gas station shelves. So they're trying to do the right thing, but there's not enough work to really make good understanding and good decisions to make the regulatory decisions we need to make. Does that make sense? We're past time? I don't know if we're... Okay, you can ask the question.
I remember you saying that heavy, or at least use before in the teenage years what was it, maybe before 18?
Adolescence, yeah, before 18.
Had some negative effects. And that was one of the things that out of everything that I've heard in my life that I actually think is true. Like I feel like I've experienced that firsthand. But also it seems interestingly that that's one of the things that's most ignored. Like fluoxetine was known to have really negative consequences for children for a long time. They still gave it to them. Ritalin as well. And I think it's kind of worse in the case of, it could be worse in the case of THC because people are so numb to the sort of sensationalist warnings or whatever. Is there, first of all, is there any way to sort of separate this and say, like, this is actually there's clear evidence that this could be a problem separate from all the other sort of, the negative press or whatever. Also, is it, you said after you're finished using it, it gets better. Is that only if you've used it when you were as an adult, or can the negative effects that you get from before adulthood also be diminished?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, you're totally fine. So I'll take it one step at a time. So I think the first part is talking about kind of how we provide evidence for those negative effects that are happening for THC use in adolescence and what we can do about that. I think the problem here is that science often negates itself. So one study is going to tell us it's super negative, and then one study is going to actually tell us it's beneficial. So we have to consider like both in the context of that situation. However, I think it's also important where we think of that cannabinoid ratio. So things like CBD, for THC is where a lot of the problems are occurring for adolescents. High potency THC, for example, the products that are getting you high is likely where those problems are occurring. And I think we need to be clear about that because a lot of what is happening now is we're saying that we should use CBD or CBG, things like that, for anxiety reduction or ADHD, and that actually might be a beneficial thing. So instead of being prescribed Ritalin as a 12-year-old, maybe the low THC products that have very little trace amounts in it but are high CBD or high CBG products might actually be a beneficial thing in the context of using them over Ritalin when there's no other option. But we need to consider the bad effects, and I think it's kind of in the dynamic of big pharma where there's going to be side effects regardless. I think we just need to be more clear on how we explain what is creating those side effects, and it's hard because, like I mentioned, there's 120 cannabinoids, and we're trying to simplify it into one thing that isn't one thing. So as much as I want to say there is a solution to that problem right now, I think it is just more evidence behind it. So we need more research that says THC is bad in adolescence, for example, or THC is not actually that impactful in adolescence if you stop using it. And we don't have that much information because we don't know those long-term use. So it is often, when you're not using it chronically, is when you kind of see those response back to normal and you see those negative effects diminish, is kind of the less long-term chronic use and more like less regular use. But when you're using it chronically, it's often harder to see those effects. At least it takes a lot longer. So from an adolescent's perspective, we don't know as much in terms of long-term effects because we'd be having to study them across the lifespan, and we don't have that information yet. So a lot of unknowns really is what all these things are saying. Perfect. Go for it.
So, in your expert opinion,
Mm-hmm.
please correct me if I get the dates wrong. In the mid-1900s, I see a lot of similarities between cannabinoids and tobacco. That there was a lot of recreational use of tobacco in schools, recreational areas, hospitals, everywhere. We were consuming tobacco. And we had, at those contemporary times, beliefs that there were some negatives, but there was a lot of positives, that it also de-stressed you, etc. And so, even though tobacco was legalized, and right now cannabis is not, it's still heavily consumed, especially at the University of Arkansas, being a student. In my opinion, and it's very much biased, I see a lot of cannabis use. Do you believe that cannabis is starting to become historically like tobacco?
Yes, I think it's interesting because I think tobacco has a lot of more concrete, like negative effects, positive or negative effects. I don't think cannabis has as much concrete evidence behind it. I think the patterns of usage, I agree, are kind of similar. I don't know as much about tobacco, but I do think that it's largely driven by those same kind of contemporary situations that are happening. So the individuals that are being told is really beneficial, or the individuals that are being told is really not beneficial. I think both of those have been driven by what they're expecting. So yes, I think it's similar. I don't think we can say as much about cannabis as we can as tobacco, because again, cannabis is so complex and it's hard to summarize it in one general drug when there's all these different exerting effects. So part of the problem here is like the nomenclature, the naming behind all of it and how we talk about it, that I think needs to be changed rather than just like what we're studying. I think there needs to be more understanding of how cannabis is as a plant and then what is derived from it, versus tobacco, which is this one thing that you can really pinpoint. Cannabis, we need to talk about as cannabinoids or delta-9 THC, CBD, CBG, cannabinoid like combined products, because the cannabis use you're talking about is likely the high-inducing cannabis use. So I think we can talk about that similarly, but then there's a whole bunch of other pieces to it that we can't talk about similarly, although I think the trends are similar to what you're saying.
Correct. And to maybe clarify But then we didn't.
Yeah.
And similarly to cannabis now, we don't know a lot about it. And actually, I have a friend that was trying to explain to me that there was no negatives of cannabis.
Yeah.
And that there's only positives. Do you believe that we'll get to a point where, through perhaps your research one day, that we can finally see that there's evidence X, Y, Z, that it does this much harm to your body, that it should be looked at as downly as tobacco, as frowned upon as tobacco?
It's hard for me to ever think it's going to be as XYZ as we want it to be, just because of how complex it is. I would like it to get to that point, but even like when we're researching it and when we're trying to understand people's use patterns, it's hard to measure because everyone's using different products. So unless we brought them in and watched them use every day, it's very hard to know what they're using. Versus tobacco, it's a little easier to quantify. It's a little easier to know exactly what they're using, how many cigarettes they're smoking, for example. Within the cannabis sciences world, like this continues to be a question, like how do we measure this? How do we get at the answers that we're trying to get at? And again, it's oftentimes we're left with a question mark. And I think as much as we want to get to that point, and that's what's driving us, is that we have to always consider the context and all the complex questions that come with it. So I don't necessarily know if we'll get to the same point with tobacco, but I think we can provide a whole lot more evidence for people to make informed decisions. So I don't know if we'll ever be there where it's like a yes, no, as much as we want it to be, but I do think it can be a yes if, or yes and, or yes, let's consider this, you know what I mean? Perfect.
Wanted to say, in addition to our display that we have, we do accept purchase suggestions. So if there is a newer title on cannabis that you're interested in reading, please recommend it to us. It helps us make choices, and we'd much prefer to purchase books that the community wants. And also, we do have a lot of databases here, and the reference librarians are trained in information literacy and finding things. So if you come across an article that has a reference to a paper that you can't find, please let us know. We'd be happy to help you find that resource. So thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you.